March 3, 1943. First light crept over Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Edward Lana's grip was firm on the control yoke of his B-25 Mitchell bomber as he monitored his fuel gauges and absorbed the steady roar of the twin Wright Cyclone engines. Peering through the scuffed plexiglass canopy, he watched 11 additional B-25s assemble behind him, their propellers carving pale arcs through the humid tropical air. What the Japanese convoy advancing through the Bismarck Sea did not realize was that within the next 15 minutes, everything it understood about naval warfare would be violently overturned by a bombing method so hazardous and unconventional that orthodox military doctrine had dismissed it as nearly suicidal. The calculations of devastation were about to be written not in the familiar language of high-altitude precision bombing, but in a radically new vocabulary measured just feet above the ocean's surface. 200 feet. That was the height at which Lana and his squadron would strike, racing mere yards above the waves at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour, low enough to feel the ocean spray, close enough to glimpse enemy faces before bombs skipped across the water like massive stones. The Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul confident in its security, shielded by 8 destroyers and dozens of Zero fighters. They were about to discover that the principles of naval engagement had been permanently rewritten. That transformation had begun 2 months earlier at the headquarters of Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Throughout 1942, American bombing efforts against Japanese shipping had been strikingly ineffective. From supposedly safe altitudes of 5,000 to 10,000 feet, bomber crews watched helplessly as their bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea, producing dramatic columns of water but achieving few direct hits. The numbers told a grim story. During one convoy interdiction attempt in January 1943, Allied aircraft flew 416 sorties yet managed to sink only 2 ships and damage 3 others. Japanese forces continued to resupply their New Guinea garrisons almost unchallenged, while the balance of the Pacific war teetered. Kenney, a First World War fighter pilot known for innovative thinking, recognized that established bombing doctrine was failing. Ships could simply maneuver away from bombs dropped from altitude. The nearly minute-long fall from 10,000 feet gave captains ample time to evade. The solution demanded attacks from such low altitudes that ships would have no opportunity to react. But flying only a few hundred feet above heavily armed warships violated every rule of bomber survivability. At that distance, anti-aircraft gunners would have unobstructed fields of fire. One direct hit could obliterate an aircraft instantly. The danger was obvious and extreme. Still, Kenney had learned of a method that promised to change the equation. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully used skip bombing near Rabaul on the nights of October 22 to 23, 1942. His aircraft released bombs that ricocheted across the water's surface, striking ships before detonating. The idea was deceptively simple. A bomber flying very low and very fast could drop delayed fuse bombs that bounced across the sea and slammed into, or beneath, a target vessel. Ben had proven the concept in combat, but he was killed on January 18, 1943, when his B-25 vanished over New Guinea before he could refine the technique for large-scale daylight attacks. No one had yet attempted coordinated squadron-level assaults. No one had completed the aircraft modifications necessary to keep medium bombers alive at mast height. No one had trained entire units to execute the split-second timing required under intense enemy fire until now. The engineer behind the transformed B-25 was Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose wife and children had been trapped in the Philippines during the Japanese invasion. Gunn's personal fury, combined with mechanical brilliance, produced what became known as the Commerce Destroyer. Working in crude maintenance conditions at Port Moresby, Gunn and his team removed the bombardier's nose position and replaced it with 4 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Additional weapons were installed along the fuselage until some aircraft carried between 8 and 12 heavy machine guns, all firing forward. The result was a flying gun platform capable of unleashing overwhelming firepower during a bombing run. These guns served 2 vital purposes. First, they suppressed enemy anti-aircraft fire by raking ship decks and eliminating gunners. The heavy .50 caliber rounds could penetrate destroyer hulls, disable gun emplacements, and sow chaos aboard enemy vessels. Second, the nose guns allowed pilots to aim the entire aircraft like a massive weapon. Unlike high-altitude bombing, which relied on bombardiers calculating complex trajectories, low-level attacks required pilots to fly directly at their targets, using a simple reference mark on the windscreen as an aiming point. When the mark aligned with the ship, the bombs were released. The method was brutally straightforward and demanded exceptional nerve. Yet modified aircraft alone were not enough. Pilots had to be trained to fly at lethal altitudes with flawless timing. That responsibility fell to Edward Lana, who assumed command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron in late December 1942. Barrel-chested and famously fearless, Lana was known for aggressive flying and leading from the front. He wore a battered service cap pushed back on his head and never asked his men to fly a mission he wouldn't lead himself. When Kenny explained the plan and showed him the altered B-25S, Lana responded with confidence. He would train his crews, and they would not miss. Training began in January 1943 over the wreck of the SS Pruth, a British freighter stranded on Natavara Reef since 1923. For weeks, crews practiced plunging to 200 feet and releasing practice bombs at the rusting hulk in Port Moresby Harbor. Each pilot dropped dozens of bombs, learning to rely on windscreen markings instead of traditional bomb sites. When one aircraft struck the ship's mast and crashed, killing all aboard, the squadron attended the funeral and resumed training the next day. Lana pushed his men relentlessly because he understood the stakes. Japanese forces were fortifying New Guinea and constructing airfields that threatened Australia itself. Allied ground troops were locked in savage jungle combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Every convoy that reached New Guinea meant more soldiers, more ammunition, and more supplies, each one translating into Allied casualties. The only way to stop them was to sink the ships at sea. By late February 1943, the squadron was ready. Lana told Kenny his men were confident and deadly accurate. Within days, they would prove it. The Japanese convoy left Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943. Allied codebreakers had uncovered its destination, New Guinea, and its estimated arrival time. 8 transport ships carried nearly 7,000 troops, guarded by 8 destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns and crewed by experienced sailors. Japanese planners believed every variable had been accounted for: weather, route, timing, and defense. But the Allies were watching. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked the convoy from departure. On March 1, a patrolling B-24 Liberator spotted the ships through a break in the clouds and radioed their position to 5th Air Force headquarters. That report activated a carefully prepared operation. Kenny assembled his forces. B-17 Flying Fortresses would strike first from medium altitude, scattering the convoy and forcing the ships into evasive maneuvers. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s from the 91st Bombardment Squadron, a 20 Havocs from the 89th Attack Squadron, Australian bow fighters, armed with cannon and machine guns, all attacking at masthead height in coordinated waves that would overwhelm the convoy's defenses. The Japanese faced the full fury of low-altitude warfare for the first time on this scale. March 2 began with frustration. Weather obscured the convoy through most of the day. B-7s sent to attack found only clouds and empty ocean. But by evening, the weather began to clear. On the morning of March 3, reconnaissance crews relocated the convoy steaming through the Bismarck Sea toward New Guinea. The ships were about 50 miles southeast of Finchharan, exactly where Allied planners had predicted they would be. Kenny gave the order. All units would attack. The battle was about to begin. Lana gathered his squadron commanders for final instructions. The plan called for different aircraft to attack from different altitudes, simultaneously creating confusion and dividing the convoy's defensive fire. B-7s would bomb from 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Bow fighters would strafe at wavetop level. The B-25s would come in behind the bow fighters at 200 feet, using their forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire while delivering their bombs. Lana's orders to his pilots were direct. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your guns to clear the decks. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out fast. The formation would attack in elements of 3 or 4 aircraft, with wingmen providing covering fire while lead planes concentrated on bombing. They would approach targets from the beam parallel to the ship's length, maximizing the target profile and giving the bombs the best angle for skipping into the hull. Timing was critical. Release the bombs too early, and they would bounce over the target. Too late and the aircraft would be directly over the ship when the delayed Fuses detonated, destroying bomber and crew. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. At 8:55 a.m., the call came. The convoy had been positively identified and was within range. Lana shouted to his squadron, Cape Ward Hunt 0930, let's go. Engines roared to life. Modified B-25s began taxiing toward the runway at Port Moresby. Behind them, a 20 crews of the 89th prepared to follow. The plan called for all attacking aircraft to rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 9:30 and strike at 10. As long as B-25 lifted off, he could see the coastline of New Guinea falling away behind him. Ahead lay open ocean and a Japanese convoy that had no idea what was coming. The flight to the target took less than an hour. At 10,000 feet, formation flying was smooth and the visibility was perfect. Lana could see the other elements of the strike force assembling. Heavy B-17s from the 43rd Bombardment Group climbed to altitude. P-38 Lightning fighters took up positions as top cover, ready to engage any Japanese fighters that might interfere. Australian bow fighters, twin-engine aircraft armed with 420mm cannons and 6 machine guns, dropped to wavetop altitude. Everything was coming together with textbook precision. At 9:55, lead B-17s spotted the convoy. 16 Japanese ships were visible on the water below, their wakes drawing white lines across the blue Pacific. 8 large transports steamed in formation, surrounded by 8 destroyers that maneuvered to provide anti-aircraft coverage. It was a formidable force, and the Japanese captains believed they were ready for any attack. At 10 a.m. precisely, the first B-7s began their bomb runs. Flying at 7,000 feet, they released 1,000 pounds bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and intense. Destroyers and transports opened fire with every anti-aircraft gun they possessed. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of fire. One transport took a direct hit and began listing immediately. Another was struck and caught fire, but most of the high-altitude bombs missed, creating massive columns of water that drenched the ships but did no damage. The Japanese captains breathed easier. This was conventional bombing. This they could handle. Then the bow fighters arrived. 13 Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters came in at masthead height, skimming the waves at over 300 miles per hour. Japanese gunners trained to track high-altitude bombers suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally across their field of fire. Before they could adjust, the bow fighters opened fire. 20mm cannon shells ripped through destroyer superstructures. Machine gun bullets swept the decks of transport ships. The heavy cannons could penetrate armored positions. Japanese sailors and soldiers crouched behind whatever cover they could find as the Australian aircraft roared past, leaving chaos in their wake. The bow fighter attack lasted only minutes, but it achieved its purpose. The convoy's defensive formation began to break apart. Destroyers mistaking the low-flying bow fighters for torpedo bombers turned bow on to present smaller targets. This maneuver standard doctrine against torpedo attacks left the transport ships more exposed. Into this chaos came Lana and his B-25s. Lana's squadron approached from the southeast at 2,000 feet, giving the pilots time to select targets and plan their attack runs. Through his windscreen, he could see the convoy spread out below. Ships maneuvering wildly, smoke rising from vessels already hit by the B-17. He selected his target, a large destroyer, and pushed his control column forward. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean in a controlled dive. At 200 feet, Lana leveled out and pushed his throttles to full power. The bomber accelerated to 225 miles per hour, the ocean surface racing past just below his wheels. His 3 wingmen followed, spacing themselves to engage different targets. Lana armed his forward guns. At 1,200 yards, Lana opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns in the nose of his B-25 erupted, sending streams of half-in bullets toward the destroyer. The effect was devastating. Japanese sailors on deck were cut down instantly. Gun positions exploded in showers of sparks as armor-piercing rounds penetrated steel. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Chaos erupted aboard the enemy vessel as gunners tried to return fire while being shredded by American machine guns. Lana held his course rock steady. The reference mark on his windscreen aligned perfectly with the destroyer's waterline. At 300 yards, his co-pilot called out ranges. 200 yards, 100 yard. At the precise moment, Lana's bombardier released two 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs dropped away and immediately struck the water. The delayed fuses prevented them from detonating on impact. Instead, the bombs skipped, bouncing off the ocean surface like stones carried forward by their momentum. The first bomb struck the water, bounced once, and slammed into the destroyer's hull at the waterline. The second bomb followed, hitting the water and skipping directly under the vessel. Lana pulled back on his control column, and the B-25 roared over the destroyer's mast with feet to spare. His gunners in the waist positions fired continuously, raking the destroyer's deck as they passed overhead. 5 seconds after the bombs hit, while Lana's B-25 was a /4 mile away, the delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the destroyer. The first bomb blew a massive hole in the hull at the waterline. The second bomb, exploding underneath the keel, broke the destroyer's back. The vessel began settling immediately, its watertight compartments flooding faster than damage control crews could respond. Behind Lana, his wingmen were executing their own attacks. Lieutenant Charles Howe went after a transport ship, his nose guns clearing the deck of personnel before his bombs skipped into the vessel's side. Captain John Henbury, leading the second element, fired continuously as he approached another transport. His tracers walking across the ship's superstructure. One of Henneby's bombs scored a direct hit amidships. The transport shuddered from the explosion, fire erupting from its cargo holds. Lieutenant John Smallwood attacked a different transport, putting 2 bombs into its hull and dropping 2 more on another vessel's bow. All around the convoy, B-25s were executing perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested in isolated night raids at Rebel was now working flawlessly on a massive scale. The Japanese response was hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the attack. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were on top of them before they could aim. The 50 caliber suppression fire from the B-25s made it nearly suicidal to man exposed gun positions. Sailors who did try to fight back were cut down by streams of bullets. The water-skipping bombs themselves were devastating. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded by maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible. By the time a lookout spotted an incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships, striking hulls with tremendous force before the delayed fuses sent explosives tearing through vital compartments. Following the B-25s came 12 A-20 Havoc light bombers from the 89th Attack Squadron, also flying at masthead height. Major Glenn Clark led the first wave of 6 aircraft. And as they approached the convoy, Clark could see explosions and fire from the B-25 attacks. He selected a large freighter as his target and began his run. At 200 feet and 240 miles per hour, Clark fired his forward guns and released 2 bombs. The weapons skipped perfectly, striking the transport and setting it ablaze. Clark's wing clipped the ship's radio mast as he pulled up and over, but his A-20 remained flyable. He circled and could see his target, later identified as Thame Maru, burning fiercely from multiple hits. Other A-20 pilots attacked with equal success. Captain Ed Chudoba bombed the same freighter Clark had hit, ensuring its destruction. Captain Dixie Dunbar and Lieutenant Jack Taylor attacked Kembaru, the smallest ship in the convoy. Their bombs struck home, and the vessel began sinking immediately. Above the low-level carnage, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived to protect the convoy. The air battle was fierce, but brief. American pilots flying aircraft superior to the Japanese fighters in speed and firepower shot down enemy planes with methodical efficiency. 3 P-38s were lost in the engagement, but their sacrifice ensured that the bombers could continue their attacks without interference. The Japanese fighters that did break through to attack the B-25s and A-20 found the bombers' defensive firepower formidable. Waist gunners and tail gunners on the American aircraft shot back fiercely, and several Japanese fighters went down to bomber defensive fire. By 10:15 a.m., just 15 minutes after the attack began, all 8 transport ships had been hit, and most were sinking or ablaze. 3 of the 8 destroyers had been badly damaged or were already going under. The water of the Bismarck Sea was filled with debris, oil slicks, and Japanese sailors abandoning ship. Above the devastation, American and Australian aircrew could barely believe what they were witnessing. The technique they had practiced for weeks had exceeded all expectations. The low-altitude attacks were not just effective, they were devastating. The convoy that had left Rabaul with such confidence was being systematically destroyed. But the battle was not over. The Japanese were nothing if not tenacious, and the remaining destroyers continued fighting even as transport ships burned around them. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned to complete the destruction. The second wave repeated the morning's devastating pattern. More B-7 bombers bombed from medium altitude, while B-25s executed precision low-altitude runs. By 3:36 p.m., 8 transport ships and 3 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The destroyer Toketsukatsu floated helplessly through the night and finally sank at sundown on March 4. Only 4 destroyers managed to escape: Shikinami, Asagumo, Yukazi, and Uranami. Even these vessels were damaged. The human cost of the battle was staggering. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Lele, only about 1,200 made it ashore. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul, but most had lost their weapons and equipment. Approximately 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. For the Allies, the losses were remarkably light. 13 American and Australian aircrew were killed. 10 died in combat while 3 perished in an accident. 8 airmen were wounded. 4 aircraft were lost in combat. 1 B-17 and 3 P-38s, 1 B-25 and 1 Bowfighter crashed in accidents against 12 Japanese ships sunk and thousands of enemy troops killed. The exchange rate was almost unbelievable. The controversy came afterward and it haunted some of the participants for the rest of their lives. On March 4, Allied aircraft and PT boats patrolled the waters where the convoy had been destroyed, searching for survivors. The orders were brutal and unambiguous: strafe the lifeboats, machine gun the rafts, prevent Japanese soldiers from reaching shore where they could be rearmed and sent back into combat. The rationale was coldly logical. Every Japanese soldier who reached New Guinea would have to be killed by American or Australian infantry in brutal jungle fighting. Better to finish them in the water than to face them again on land. The execution of the order was devastating to those who carried it out. Pilots reported sighting groups of 200 survivors on rafts and receiving orders to attack until there were no survivors. PT boats machine gun Japanese in the water through the night. The justification offered by American commanders pointed to Japanese atrocities and tactical necessity. During the battle, Japanese Zero fighters had strafed American airmen who had bailed out of a damaged B-17 called double trouble, shooting them as they drifted down in their parachutes. Allied soldiers fighting in New Guinea had witnessed Japanese troops conducting bayonet practice on prisoners, engaging in cannibalism, and refusing to surrender even when facing certain death. The brutal reality of the Pacific War made mercy seem like a luxury neither side could afford. Yet for the aircrew who carried out the attacks on survivors, the mission was haunting. Some struggled with the memory for decades. They understood the military necessity. They had heard the stories of Japanese atrocities. But shooting helpless men in the water violated something fundamental in their understanding of warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. His assessment was accurate. The battle proved that land-based aircraft could destroy naval convoys without the support of surface ships or carriers. It demonstrated that low-altitude bombing was not a desperate gamble, but a reliable tactic that could be practiced and perfected. Most importantly, it closed the sea routes to New Guinea. After witnessing the destruction of the Lele convoy, Japanese commanders made no further attempts to reinforce their New Guinea garrisons by ship. The isolation of Japanese forces on the island was complete, and their eventual defeat became inevitable. For Edward Lana, the architect and leader of the attacks, the victory was the high point of his military career. He had taken a technique that had been tested in isolated night raids and perfected it through relentless training, then led his men into combat with results that exceeded every expectation. His B-25 crews had scored 17 direct hits out of 37 bombs dropped, an accuracy rate that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. Kenny praised Lana and recommended him for promotion and decoration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron became legendary throughout the Pacific Theater. Sadly, Lana did not survive to see the end of the war. On April 30, 1943, less than 2 months after his triumph at the Bismarck Sea, he was killed in a flying accident. Coming into land at Doadura Airfield, he performed his trademark maneuver, diving toward the runway and pulling up sharply into a Chundel. The stunt had always been spectacular and slightly dangerous, but Lana had performed it dozens of times without incident. This time was different. His B-25 was heavily loaded with fuel, 8 passengers, baggage, tools, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. When he pulled back on the control column at the bottom of the dive, the overloaded bomber stalled. It went into a flat spin, crashed, and exploded on the ground. There were no survivors. Lana left behind a wife and 2 daughters. He was buried at Port Moresby with full military honors. His legend secured by the 15 minutes of combat that changed naval warfare forever. Captain John Henbury, one of Lana's wingmen in the Bismarck Sea attack, took command of the 90th Squadron and led it through the rest of the war. The squadron continued using the techniques Lana had perfected, sinking dozens more Japanese ships throughout 1943 and 1944. Henterbury himself rose to the rank of Major General and eventually served as president of the Air Force Association, carrying forward the legacy of innovation and aggressive leadership that Lana had exemplified. The tactical innovations developed for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea spread throughout the Pacific Theater and beyond. Other squadrons converted their B-25s into gunships, adding nose cannons and forward-firing machine guns. 20 and B-26 units adopted low-altitude attacks as standard procedure for anti-shipping operations. The technique even spread to the Mediterranean theater, where American bombers used it against German and Italian vessels. The British, who had experimented with similar tactics early in the war, refined their own version after learning of the American success. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was profound. Ship captains, who had once felt relatively safe when protected by destroyer escorts and fighter coverage, now understood that they were vulnerable to attacks they could not evade or defend against effectively. The convoy system that had sustained Japanese garrisons across the Pacific became untenable in areas where Allied land-based aircraft could operate. Japanese planners were forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyer runs conducted at night, accepting far lower cargo capacities and much higher risk. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated Lieutenant General Kenny's strategic vision. His insistence on modifying conventional bombers for unconventional missions, his willingness to embrace unorthodox tactics, and his ability to identify and promote aggressive leaders like Lana proved decisive. Kenny's approach became a model for air power employment in the Pacific. He demonstrated that innovation and adaptation could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. The 5th Air Force under his command dominated the skies over the Southwest Pacific, providing the air superiority that made MacArthur's island-hopping campaign possible. The technical lessons were equally significant. Aircraft designers learned that medium bombers could be successfully modified for roles far beyond their original specifications. The B-25 Mitchell, designed as a conventional medium-altitude bomber, became one of the most versatile aircraft of the war after being converted into a gunship. The forward-firing armament concept influenced post-war attack aircraft design. The principle of combining suppressive fire with precision weapons delivery became fundamental to close air support doctrine. For the individual pilots and crew members who participated in the battle, the experience was transformative. They had trained for a mission that seemed nearly impossible. They had faced anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range. They had delivered bombs with split-second timing while flying at speeds that left no margin for error, and they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The confidence gained from that success carried through the rest of their military service. Men who had doubted the tactics before the battle became its most fervent advocates afterward. Crews that had been skeptical about attacking warships at 200 feet became eager for more missions. The 90th Squadron developed an esprit de corps that made it one of the most effective units in the Pacific theater. The statistical analysis of the battle reveals the dramatic effectiveness of low-altitude attacks compared to conventional high-altitude tactics. The B-7 bombers bombing from 5,000 to 7,000 feet achieved approximately a 3% hit rate, consistent with PCEM practice, but inadequate against maneuvering targets. The B-25s and A-20, using low-altitude techniques at 200 feet, achieved hit rates exceeding 50%, with some crews scoring hits with every bomb dropped. The difference was attributable to multiple factors. Reduced distance meant less time for targets to maneuver. Horizontal trajectory required less precise timing than vertical drops. Suppressive fire degraded enemy defensive capabilities. And the psychological impact of aircraft roaring over mastheads disrupted enemy response coordination. The development of the technique required solving numerous technical challenges. Bombs had to be equipped with delayed fuses that would survive the initial impact with water without detonating. The fuse delay had to be long enough for the aircraft to escape the blast radius, but short enough that the weapon detonated against or near the target. Pilots learned through extensive practice that releasing bombs from exactly 200 feet at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour produced the most consistent results. Deviations of even 20 feet in altitude or 10 miles per hour in speed could cause bombs to sink immediately rather than skip or to skip over the target entirely. The precision required was extraordinary, achieved through hundreds of practice runs and the innate skill of experienced pilots who could gauge altitude and speed by instinct. The modified B-25s themselves represented a remarkable feat of field engineering. Major Paul Gunn and his maintenance crews performed modifications that North American Aviation, the manufacturer, had never imagined. The structural changes required to mount additional weapons, the electrical systems needed to fire multiple machine guns simultaneously, the ammunition storage solutions for thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, all had to be improvised with limited tools and resources. That these field modifications worked reliably under combat conditions testified to the ingenuity and dedication of the ground crews. Many of the maintenance personnel worked 18-hour days keeping the aircraft flyable. They scred parts from damaged planes. They fabricated brackets and mounts from scrap metal. They kept the B-25s in the air through determination and improvisation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also highlighted the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in modern warfare. The Allied victory was possible only because codewreakers had revealed the convoy's route and destination. Reconnaissance aircraft had located and tracked the ships despite bad weather. Communication systems had Coordinated attacks by multiple squadrons across vast distances. The integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities demonstrated the evolution of warfare into an increasingly technological and information-dependent enterprise. The Japanese convoy failed not because its commanders were incompetent, but because every aspect of its mission had been compromised by superior Allied intelligence gathering and exploitation. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in the struggle for New Guinea. Japanese forces on the island, already under pressure from Australian and American ground forces, found themselves cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The garrison at Lae, which the destroyed convoy had been intended to reinforce, fell to Allied forces 6 months later in September 1943. The Japanese defensive perimeter contracted inexorably as island after island fell to American amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming air power. The air superiority that made these invasions possible was built on the foundation laid at the Bismarck Sea. The battle demonstrated that Allied forces could dominate not just the skies, but also the seas around contested territories through innovative application of land-based air power. The human dimension of the battle deserves remembrance. Beyond the statistics of ships sunk and aircraft lost were individual stories of courage and sacrifice. The B-17 crew who bailed out of double trouble only to be machine-gunned by Japanese fighters while dangling helplessly in their parachutes. The P-38 pilots who went down fighting to protect the bombers. The Japanese sailors who stayed at their posts firing anti-aircraft guns even as their ships disintegrated around them. The Allied aircrew who flew mission after mission knowing that a single mistake at 200 feet meant certain death. War demands courage from all participants, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea witnessed extraordinary courage on both sides. The controversy over attacks on survivors has never been fully resolved. Military historians generally accept that the decision was militarily justifiable within the context of total war in the Pacific. Every Japanese soldier eliminated at sea meant lives saved among Allied ground forces who would otherwise have faced those soldiers in combat. Given Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized fighting to the death and made surrender almost unknown, allowing survivors to reach shore guaranteed more casualties later, yet the ethical dimension remains troubling. Attacking helpless men in the water violated codes of military honor that dated back centuries. The pragmatic argument that Japanese forces would have done the same and had done worse does not fully address the moral complexity. Some participants struggled with the memory for the rest of their lives, while others maintained that they had simply done what war required. Modern military analysts studying the Battle of the Bismarck Sea identify several key factors that contributed to Allied success. Tactical innovation driven by operational necessity solved the problem of hitting maneuvering ships. Realistic training prepared crews for actual combat conditions. Coordinated use of multiple aircraft types in complementary roles exemplified combined arms effectiveness. Accurate intelligence supplied crucial targeting information and supported meticulous mission planning. Technological adaptation transformed standard aircraft to fulfill specialized functions. Each element was essential. Together, they ensured victory. The engagement serves as a prime example of how innovation, training, intelligence, and integrated operations can overcome numerical or technological disadvantages. Edward Lana's legacy extends far beyond his brief life. His willingness to adopt an unconventional tactic and his skill in preparing crews to execute it saved countless Allied lives. Every Japanese soldier lost in the Bismarck Sea meant one fewer enemy confronting American or Australian troops in New Guinea's jungles. Each sunken ship represented one less cargo of weapons and supplies capable of killing Allied soldiers. The tactic Lana refined became the benchmark for anti-shipping operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. Over the next 2 years, thousands of Japanese vessels succumbed to low-altitude attacks. Japan's maritime supply lines, vital to sustaining its sprawling empire, were systematically cut by aircraft operating at heights once considered suicidal. In reunions held decades later, veterans of the Bismarck Sea action spoke with a mixture of pride and amazement, pride in their achievement, amazement that they had survived. The 15 minutes of combat at masthead altitude, navigating walls of anti-aircraft fire and delivering bombs with split-second precision, had been the most intense experience of their lives. Many likened it to flying through hell itself. Yet they emerged victorious, their tactics vindicated, their bravery proven, their place in history secured. The principles confirmed that the Bismarck remain applicable to modern military operations. Innovation can overcome conventional limits. Realistic training prepares forces for real combat. Integrating diverse capabilities achieves effects greater than the sum of individual parts. Modifying existing systems addresses emergent challenges faster than waiting for perfect solutions. Exploiting intelligence confers decisive advantages. Lessons learned over the Pacific 80 years ago continue to guide planning and execution today. Though the names of those who fought may fade, the doctrines they prove through courage and sacrifice endure for every generation tasked with defending freedom. The Battle of the Bismarck stands as one of the Pacific War's most decisive clashes. A Japanese convoy that should have reached its destination intact was obliterated by inventive tactics executed with exceptional skill. The approach that secured victory had once been deemed nearly suicidal by conventional military reasoning. Edward Lana and his crews demonstrated that orthodox doctrine was inadequate. They flew at altitudes that invited destruction, released bombs with no room for error, and achieved results beyond expectation. 12 Japanese ships sank beneath the waves, thousands of enemy soldiers perished, the route to New Guinea was cut, and the trajectory of the war irrevocably shifted toward Allied success, all within 15 minutes of combat that showcased courage, ingenuity, and resolve. The previously forbidden tactic became standard. The once dangerous method became routine. The seemingly impossible mission became a template for countless successful operations. Lana did not live to witness the Pacific War's final victory, but his impact was immeasurable. Pilots who followed him at 200 feet carried forward his legacy. The methods he perfected sank hundreds of Japanese ships over the ensuing 2 years, and the bravery he embodied inspired thousands of aircrew confronting similar perils. His name rightly belongs alongside the great innovators of military history, leaders who reshaped warfare through vision and daring. The Battle of the Bismarck was his masterpiece, and its lessons continue to echo through the decades, inspiring new generations to confront challenges with the same blend of innovation, preparation, courage, and determination that defined those 15 minutes over the Pacific in March 1943, when everything changed.